The first cruelty of the season was meant to be quiet, a sentence folded into the hush between two chords of a waltz, but Isolde Vane heard every word. "She'll be forgotten by spring," the Duke said, and though his voice was pitched for the ear of the woman on his arm, it carried the way certain voices are trained to carry, the way rank moves loudly, even when it whispers. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give them the satisfaction of a flinch that could be reported later as proof she had understood. The ballroom at Marlbrook House, in the last week of an autumn that had refused to end, tilted its chandeliers toward the center of the floor and away from the alcove where she stood, and the light seemed to agree with the Duke, seemed to have decided in advance which faces were worth gilding and which were to be left in the useful dimness near the servants' door. The room itself was a long gallery of mirrors and cold gilt, and the mirrors doubled every silk and every jewel until the crowd looked twice as numerous as it was, and Isolde, in her mother's gray wool traveling gown, remade with new cuffs and a plain collar, was doubled too, but only into a second gray shape that the eye slid off. A small word had been assigned to her already, before she had crossed the threshold, and the word was ornamental. It was the word the household used when they wished to explain her presence without granting it weight. Ornamental, it was said kindly, sometimes, and unkindly more often, and it was meant to place her where a vase is placed, near the door, useful for a moment on the way in, invisible on the way out. She wore at her throat the only thing she had brought from the house on Ashfield Row that had not been sold to pay her uncle's tailor, a small oval locket of dulled silver on a ribbon that had once been black and was now the softer, kinder color that black becomes when it has been washed too often to remember itself. Inside the locket was nothing anyone else would have valued, a curl of pale hair the color of winter wheat, and a scrap of paper on which her mother had written 8 words in a handwriting that leaned forward as though it meant to keep walking after the pen stopped. "Small things carry their own weight," her mother had written, and the sentence had lived first on the inside of a workbasket lid, then on the inside of a locket, and now on the inside of a daughter who was trying very hard, in a room designed to make her feel weightless, to remember that she had ever been told so. The music resumed, having paused only for the length of a breath, and the couples on the floor turned as one, a garden of silks bending toward the wrong sun, and the Duke of Ashenmire passed her without looking, because a man of his standing did not have to look at what he had already dismissed. She had known him by reputation for as long as she had known the word Duke. Sebastian Rhys, the 5th to hold Ashenmire, was said to be exact where other men were merely severe, and quiet where other men were merely reserved, and it was said further, in the safer parlors, that his silences were more informative than most men's speeches, if one had the patience and the standing to translate. He had neither smiled nor scowled as he spoke his sentence over her. The sentence had simply been placed, the way a coin is placed on a counter, and the woman on his arm, Lady Cressida Marlbrook, had laughed the small pearled laugh she had been taught to laugh in company, not loud enough to be a threat and not quiet enough to be safe. Isolde watched the pair of them move down the length of the gallery until the crowd closed politely behind them, and she felt, for a single unguarded instant, the pull of the catalogue of unsaid retorts, all the answers she might have given if she had been a different woman, or the same woman in a different gown, or the same woman with the same gown and a mother still alive to stand at her shoulder. She could have said that spring had a longer memory than Duke's. She could have said that the forgotten were often the ones who kept the calendar. She could have said nothing at all and let the silence do the work a sentence would only spoil. She said nothing, and the silence did nothing, because no one had been listening for her answer in the first place, and that too was familiar. Her cousin Perpetua found her a moment later, as Perpetua always found her, by the quality of light that made Isolde easiest to overlook. "Darling," Perpetua said, threading her arm through Isolde's with the practiced tenderness of a woman who had discovered, at 15, that affection displayed in public was a currency that spent twice. "You must not stand so near the door. You look as though you are about to be sent for the coats." The words sounded affectionate. The pressure underneath them was not. Perpetua was in rose, satin the color of a confection that has been left too long in a warm window, and her hair had been dressed by a woman who charged by the curl. And she smelled of the orange flower water Isolde had mixed for her that morning, with hands that still bore the small pale scars of a childhood spent doing what other girls' hands were spared. "I was admiring the ceiling," Isolde said, "because it was true in the way certain answers are true, and because Perpetua did not require the whole truth, only a plausible one to hand up to the next passing acquaintance." Perpetua accepted the ceiling and moved on. "You will fetch me a glass of the pale wine, will you, dearest? The kind on the smaller tray. And if you happen upon Mrs. Vele, tell her the pins in my hem have shifted. She will know what to do." It was not a question. It was never a question. Isolde inclined her head the exact fraction that manners required, and she went, and as she went she performed, without being asked, the small unnoticed office that no one in the room but her knew she was performing. She carried, in the back of her mind, the seating for the supper that would be laid at midnight, the 7 adjustments her aunt had failed to make and would blame someone else for failing to make, the letter from the modiste in Hanover Street that had arrived after luncheon and been left, unopened, on the hall table, because Perpetua did not care to know what the modiste had to say about the balance owing, and the fact that the second footman was drunk and would need to be traded for the third before the ices came up. Small things carry their own weight. She had been taught that they could also carry other people's if one were not careful, and she was not always careful, because it was easier to be tired than to be resented. She fetched the pale wine. She spoke to Mrs. Vale. She adjusted, on her way back through the gallery, a candle that was guttering in a draught the housekeeper had missed, and she caught, without letting her hand seem to do more than pass, a small enameled snuff-box that a distinguished old gentleman had dropped from a sleeve too loose for the fashion he had insisted on. And she returned it to him with the smallest of curtsies and the smallest of smiles, and he thanked her, as men thank a servant, warmly and without seeing her, and moved on. No one saw. That too was familiar. It would have surprised her, had she known, that one person in the room had seen all of it, that the Duke of Ashenbury, having deposited Lady Cressida with her mother and taken up a position near a pillar from which the length of the gallery could be observed, without the observer being observed in return, had watched a young woman in gray wool move through his hostess's ballroom repairing, without fuss and without credit, the small failures the household had strewn in her path. He did not smile. He did not frown. He noted, as a man of his exactness noted, that the candle had been guttering and was no longer, that the snuff-box had fallen and had been restored, that the second footman had been quietly replaced, and he noted further, with the faint interior displeasure of a man who prefers his judgments to remain undisturbed, that the young woman doing these things was the same young woman he had, half an hour earlier, condemned to be forgotten by spring. He did not amend the sentence. He filed it, in the careful ledger of a mind that did not often need to file anything twice, under the small heading he reserved for observations that would require further evidence before they could be permitted to become anything else. The heading, had it been visible, would have read only, to be revisited. Isolde delivered the pale wine to Perpetua and stood again in the useful dimness near the servants' door and watched the dance, And she did not permit herself the small self-indulgence of counting the couples, because counting would have meant admitting that she was not among them, and admitting that would have meant admitting she had once believed she might be. And she had spent the 4 years since her mother's death teaching herself, patiently, one narrow lesson at a time, not to believe things that would only cost her more when they failed. She had come to Marlbrook House at 17, the year after her father's small estate in Ashfield had been sold to pay debts he had never mentioned to her while he lived, and her uncle had received her at the door with the studied kindness of a man performing charity in front of witnesses, and her aunt had received her in the small back parlor with a different kindness altogether. The kindness of a woman calculating exactly how many hours a day a niece could be worked without the neighbors noticing. 4 years, she was 21 now, and the household had settled around her as a garment settles around a body it did not quite fit, tight at the shoulders and loose at the wrists, and the shape of her days had been decided for her in 100 small unwritten clauses. She dressed Perpetua. She wrote Perpetua's letters when Perpetua's spelling threatened to embarrass the family. She kept the household books because her uncle preferred not to know what the household cost him, and her aunt preferred not to know what she had spent. She arranged flowers for rooms she would not sit in, and menus for dinners at which she would be seated at the corner, and asked, on the 6th remove, whether she found the weather trying. She was, in the phrase her aunt used most often when explaining her to visitors, ornamental. It was said the way one might say useful of a plain drawer pull. It meant that she was permitted to be present so long as she did not require anything the family did not wish to give. The word had a way of arriving early in every conversation about her, the way a herald arrives before a lesser guest, and she had watched it over 4 years do its steady work of making her smaller in rooms in which she had once briefly imagined she might be seen. She had learned not to argue with it. Arguing would only have added a syllable to it, and the word was already heavy enough. What had been taken from her was not, on any single day, a large thing. It was, on every day, a small thing. Her mother's book of receipts, which she had inherited, and which Perpetua had claimed 6 months into her residence, on the grounds that Perpetua wished to learn to keep a house, and Isolde would surely not mind sharing. The 3 pieces of good lace from the bottom of her mother's work-basket, which had been repurposed for a bonnet Perpetua had worn twice and grown tired of. The design for a small conservatory garden that Isolde had drawn one winter evening on the back of a household bill and left on the writing desk, and that had reappeared 3 months later in her aunt's letter of instructions to the gardener, unsigned, the letter of introduction her father's old friend had written for her, urging that she be presented at court in her own name during her first season, and not as an appendage of the Marlbrook party, which had been mislaid, her aunt had said, with such regret, and never found. And, most lately, the small article her father's old friend had asked her to write on the management of a country stillroom for the almanac he edited, which she had written in 3 careful evenings and given to her uncle to post because she had no free hour to walk to the receiving office herself, and which had appeared in the almanac 6 weeks later under the name of a cousin of her uncle's who had never, in his life, ground a lavender head between his fingers. She had said nothing when she had seen the almanac. She had turned the page. She had put the almanac back on the small table in the morning room, and she had gone upstairs and taken out the locket and read the 8 words on the scrap of paper inside, and she had said them aloud once, in a whisper so faint that even the room did not disturb itself to hear. And she had come back down and asked Perpetua whether the pale blue ribbon or the yellow would suit her better for the concert on Thursday. Small things carry their own weight. She had begun, without meaning to test the sentence for cracks. She had not found any yet. She was not sure whether she was relieved. In the ballroom at Marlbrook House, the music slid from a waltz into a slower measure, and the dowagers along the wall composed their faces into the expressions that would carry them through the next quarter of an hour without effort. And Isolde watched her aunt, Lady Marlbrook, cross the floor toward her with a particular determined smile that meant a use had been found for her. "There you are, my dear," Lady Marlbrook said, as though there had been any question of where. Come with me. I want you to meet someone." Lady Wexley has expressed a wish to see the girl she has heard so much about, and I told her that of course she should. Isolde permitted herself, in the private country behind her face, one small exact thought, which was that Lady Wexley had almost certainly not expressed a wish to see anyone, and that her aunt had almost certainly told Lady Wexley that of course she should, but she did not permit the thought to move her mouth. "Of course," she said, and she went. Lady Wexley was a small woman with a hard bright eye and a diamond aigrette that had been the fashion the year before last, and had not, in her opinion, ceased to be so. She examined Isolde as a woman examines a length of stuff she has been offered at a price she considers optimistic. "So this is the little cousin," she said, to Lady Marlbrook over Isolde's head, though Isolde was the taller of them by half a head. The one whose father, poor man, was so unfortunate. "So unfortunate," Lady Marlbrook agreed, with the sigh she reserved for the misfortunes of others. "But of course we could not think of leaving her to strangers. Blood, you know, is blood." "Blood," said Lady Wexley, in a voice like the word had a small stone in it, "is indeed blood. And what does the little cousin do with herself?" The question was aimed at Isolde without being addressed to her. Isolde had learned to answer such questions as if they had been. "I read, ma'am," she said, "and I keep the household books, and I am learning to draw." "Draw," Lady Wexley said. "How useful." The word arrived with the small, dry weight it always arrived with in that gallery, and Perpetua, drifting up on the current of some newer conversation, laughed the pearled laugh she had been taught. "Isolde draws beautifully," Perpetua said. "She is quite an artist, we all say so, though of course she has never had a proper master. Poor darling, we have done what we can." "How very kind of you," said Lady Wexley, and turned her attention to a passing tray. Isolde inclined her head. She had, over 4 years, learned the exact fraction that manners required. It was smaller than most people suppose it. She had also learned that a person who mastered that fraction could pass through any evening of any house in the county without giving anyone a single sentence they might use against her later. And she had learned that this was the only true safety a woman in her position was permitted to earn for herself. And she had learned, too, that safety earned this way tasted, at the end of a long evening, exactly like nothing at all. The Duke of Ashenbury, from his pillar, watched the small transaction and noted, without permitting his face to reflect the noting, that the girl in grey wool had answered a rudeness with a courtesy, so exact it had left the rudeness nowhere to sit down. He noted, further, that the pearled laugh belonged to the cousin, and that the cousin's compliment had been a small, careful blade sheathed in a phrase, and he noted that the girl in grey wool had received the blade without reacting, in the manner of a person who has learned that the safest way to survive a household of small blades is to appear to have no skin. He revisited, in the private ledger of his mind, the sentence he had spoken half an hour earlier under a chord of the waltz. He did not withdraw it. He annotated it. The annotation, had anyone been permitted to read the ledger, would have said only, "Perhaps not by spring." Later, when the ices had come up, and the second footman had been persuaded to sit in the pantry with a bowl of water and a piece of bread, and Perpetua had been placed by her mother in the small chair beside Lord Halberd, whose estate marched conveniently with her father's, Isolde stepped out through the long window at the end of the gallery onto the stone terrace above the winter garden. The night was cold in a way that the ballroom had not permitted itself to know. The wind had risen while the music played, and the sky over the park had cleared to a hard, bright dark, and the stars, which had waited patiently for the candles inside to give up some of their share of the world, now stood over the roofs of Marlbrook House, with the calm indifference of guests who had been kept waiting too long to bother with courtesy. Isolde stood at the balustrade and permitted herself, for the first time that evening, the small luxury of feeling the cold in her hands. Her fingers had grown warm from carrying trays and pins and the small unnoticed tasks of the household, and the cold took the warmth away with a thoroughness that felt, briefly, like kindness. She closed her hand around the locket at her throat. Small things carry their own weight. She said the sentence to herself, silently, and she added, silently, the small addendum that had begun to attach itself to the sentence over the past 6 weeks, since the almanac had appeared and been turned face down and put away, and the addendum was, and sometimes other people's, and one day, perhaps, one's own. She did not know yet whether the addendum was hope or warning. She suspected it might be both. She did not hear the long window open behind her, because the wind was in the terrace ivy and the ivy was making the small sound ivy makes when it agrees with the wind, but she felt, in the way one feels a shift in a room, that she was no longer alone. She did not turn at once. She had learned not to. If it was her aunt, turning would only invite an errand. If it was Perpetua, turning would only invite a request. If it was a stranger, turning would only invite the pleasantry that would then require the reply, and she had, for 1/4 of an hour, no reply in her. She stood where she was and let the person behind her decide whether to speak. "You will take cold," a voice said. It was a quiet voice. It did not need to be louder. She knew the voice, though she had heard it, that evening, speak only one sentence in her hearing, and that sentence had been about her. She turned then, because there are courtesies that cannot be refused without becoming a different kind of statement, and she found the Duke of Achènemery at the long window, one hand still on the frame. The light of the ballroom falling on the side of his face that was turned away from her and leaving the side that was turned toward her in the softer, more truthful darkness of the terrace. He was taller than she had let herself register from the alcove. He was, in the darkness, less severe than the drawing rooms had drawn him. His eyes, which the gossip papers had described as gray, were in this light closer to the color of the slate on the roofs of the stable block, and they rested on her with the calm interest one might give a small creature one had not expected to find crossing a polished surface. "I have a shawl," she said. Which was almost true. The shawl was on a chair inside, and she had not meant to leave it. Only to breathe for a moment where breathing did not require permission. "Then, you have left it somewhere it cannot help you," he said. He did not smile, but the sentence had, in it, the faint, dry warmth she had heard other people describe and had not believed. He stepped out onto the terrace and let the long window close behind him, and the music, cut off, seemed to move a great distance away in an instant, as though the house itself had agreed to give them a small privacy she had not asked for, and could not, without rudeness, refuse, Your Grace, she said, and made the small curtsy she had been taught, no smaller and no deeper than the occasion required. "Miss Vane," he said. He had then learned her name. She did not know, in that instant, whether the learning was a courtesy or an accusation, and she chose for her own sake to treat it as the first. "I am not, at present, required within," he said. "You are not, at present, required within. Marlbrook House will manage without either of us for 1/4 of an hour. Will you allow me the terrace, or must I retreat and leave it to you?" She considered him. She considered the sentence he had spoken earlier, under the chord of the waltz, and she considered that he had spoken it without knowing that she stood within hearing, and that a lesser man, discovering his error, would have arranged the encounter differently, would have contrived in the language of drawing rooms to make her feel the sentence had never been said. He had not contrived. He had come out to the terrace and said her name and offered her a choice. It was not an apology. It was, she thought, something rarer, which was the refusal to pretend. "You may have the terrace, Your Grace," she said, "as I have no better claim to it than a wish for the cold." "Then we may share it," he said, "for I have no better claim to it than the same." He moved, not toward her, but along the balustrade, until he stood at a distance that was neither the distance of a stranger nor the distance of an intimate, and he placed one gloved hand on the stone and looked out over the winter garden, as though he had come out to see the winter garden, and had merely, in passing, found her there. She turned her face again toward the park. They stood in silence for the length of time it takes a cloud, moving fast, to cross the face of a hard, bright moon. Then he said, "Without looking at her, I said something earlier that I would not have said had I known you stood within hearing." She let the sentence stand between them for a moment before she answered it. She had prepared, in the alcove, several answers. She discarded them, one by one. "It was not," she said at last, "a sentence you would have altered had you known. It was only a sentence you would not have said aloud." She heard in her own voice the faint, clean edge of the truth she had not meant to give him, and she waited for the sentence to be resented. It was not. He inclined his head, slightly, the way a man inclines his head when he has been shown a piece of workmanship better than the one he had expected. "That is fair," he said. "It is also true. I did not know you. I permitted myself an opinion on evidence I had not gathered. I do not, generally, permit myself that." "Generally," she said, quietly, before she could stop the word. Generally, he agreed, and there was, at the corner of his mouth, the faintest possible movement that might, in a warmer man, have been a smile, and that in him was only the acknowledgement that a small blade had touched him and had not drawn blood because he had chosen to let it pass. "You are Marlbrook's niece. I am. You have been in the house 4 years. I have, and in those 4 years no one has told me your name." "No, Your Grace." "That," he said, still looking at the winter garden, "is a failure I should like to attribute to Marlbrook, and cannot, because I have been in this room a dozen times in those 4 years and did not ask." He did not turn to her as he said it. She was grateful for that. It let her keep her face where it was, turned toward the park, and it let her lift the corner of her mouth the small distance it wished to lift without offering the movement to be misread. "You had no cause to ask, Your Grace," she said. "I had no cause not to," he said. "That is a different matter." A silence followed the sentence, and the silence did the work that some silences do, which was to admit that a small thing had passed between two people and would not now be unpassed. Down in the winter garden, an owl called once and did not call again. In the ballroom behind them, the music turned into the last figure of the set, and the shape of the sound changed as the couples turned. The Duke of Ashenbury lifted his hand from the balustrade. "You will take cold," he said again, "and if you take cold I shall have to answer for it to your aunt, who will find a way of blaming me that is also, by careful construction, a way of praising herself. Come inside, Miss Vane. Your shawl is on the chair by the second pillar. I noted it as I passed." She looked at him then, fully, for the first time. He met the look. He did not linger over it. He turned back toward the long window and set his hand on the frame and waited. She went in. She retrieved the shawl. She did not thank him aloud, because the moment did not require it, and because she did not yet know whether thanks were owed. He inclined his head to her at the pillar, precisely the fraction he would have inclined it to any woman of any house he had chosen to notice, and he moved on into the room, and within a minute he was speaking to a general and a bishop about a matter of drainage on a canal, and no one in the gallery would have guessed that a quarter of an hour earlier he had stood on a cold terrace and admitted to a girl in gray wool that he had been unjust. Isolde stood at the second pillar and drew the shawl about her shoulders and felt for the first time in 4 years in Marlbrook House the small dangerous warmth of having been seen. She did not permit the warmth to become anything else. She had learned, over 4 years, that warmth could be a debt as easily as a gift, and that a woman in her position who accepted warmth without weighing it accepted, without knowing, a great many other things at the same time. Still, when she looked, without meaning to, across the length of the gallery to where the Duke of Ashenbury stood in conversation with the general and the bishop, she found that his eyes, which were not on her, had nevertheless, for the fraction of an instant, been on her, and that he had permitted her to see that they had been. It was not admiration. It was not yet anything she had a name for. It was, she thought, recognition, of a kind so small it could easily be denied in the morning, and she resolved to deny it, in the morning, because denial was cheaper than hope, and she had, for 4 years, been keeping her accounts. She did not know that on the other side of the gallery, in the private ledger of a mind that did not often need to revisit its entries, an annotation was being made a second time, and the annotation now read, not by spring, and perhaps not at all. The evening ended, as such evenings always ended, in a slow tide of departures. Cloaks were fetched. Carriages were called. The dowagers embraced with the careful economy of women who did not wish to disturb their headdresses. Perpetua, on her way to the door, discovered that a pin in her hem had shifted again, and Isolde knelt in the vestibule and reset it with fingers that had grown cold and remembered how to be warm the moment they had work to do. Lady Marlbrook, on the step, pronounced the evening a great success and did not specify for whom. Lord Marlbrook, in the carriage, fell asleep before the horses had turned out of the sweep. Perpetua leaned her head against Isolde's shoulder and said, drowsily, that Lord Halberd had been very attentive, and that Mamma was pleased, and that Isolde had been a great help, and that she did not know what any of them would do without her, and Isolde said, softly, that she was glad, and did not add the sentence her mother would have added, which was that people who did not know what they would do without one were, more often than not, people who had never troubled to imagine it. The house on Cavendish Street received them in the dim red glow of a hall lamp turned low. Isolde saw Perpetua to her room and undid the small clasps at the back of the rose satin gown and unpinned the hair the woman had charged by the curl to arrange, and she banked the fire in the grate and set the water jug closer to the coals so it would be warm in the morning, and she went at last to her own room at the top of the back stair, which had been the second housemaid's room until the second housemaid had left, and which had a window that looked into the mews. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and unfastened the locket from her throat and held it a moment in her palm, and she said the 8 words her mother had written, aloud this time, in a voice barely above a breath, because the house was asleep and no one would hear. Small things carry their own weight. She closed the locket. She set it on the small table by the bed, where she could see it in the morning without turning her head. She lay down in the dark and listened to the mews below, where a horse shifted in a stall and a groom coughed and went back to sleep, and she considered. For the length of time it takes a candle to gutter in a room that has no candle, the sentence the Duke of Ashenmiri had spoken under the waltz, and the sentence he had spoken on the terrace, and the small movement at the corner of his mouth that had not, quite, been a smile. She did not permit herself to consider what any of it might mean. She had, for 4 years, kept her accounts, and her accounts had taught her that the ledger balanced only when hope was entered on the correct side. She turned her face to the wall. She slept. She did not know, and could not have known, that a mile away, in a house on Grosvenor Square that had been shut for 3/4 of the year, and opened only that week, the Duke of Ashenmiri sat at a writing desk in a room with one candle, and drew toward him a small ledger bound in dark leather that no one else had ever been permitted to see, and turned to a page that had been blank that morning, and wrote, in the exact hand he had been taught by a tutor 30 years dead, 3 words at the top of the page, and nothing beneath them. The 3 words were her name. By the following morning, the frost had come. It lay along the black railings of Cavendish Street in a thin, bright rime, and on the tops of the wheels of the carriages waiting at the corner, and along the sills of the tall windows of the house, and Isolde, coming down before the family were awake to see that the fires had been lit and the kitchen had begun its morning, paused at the window on the half landing to look at it. The frost had turned the plane trees along the square into their own drawings of themselves, and the light, which had not yet risen above the rooftops, had begun to move in that pale, reluctant way it moves in the last week of a long autumn, when winter has already arrived, but has not yet been announced. She stood at the window and permitted herself to look at it for the length of time it took the housemaid on the ground floor to open and close the door of the morning-room grate. Then she went down and began the day. The day arrived in the shape it always arrived. Perpetua was to be dressed. The books were to be balanced. A note had come from the modist in Hanover Street with a request that could no longer be politely deferred, and the note was to be answered with a sentence that would defer it a little longer without giving offense, and the sentence, when written, was to be signed in Lady Marlbrook's hand, which Isolde had been taught, at 15, to copy, and which she copied now with the small, clean guilt of a person who has grown used to a wrong and no longer notices it as such. A tradesman was to be paid. Another was to be told, with regret, that payment would follow at the end of the quarter. The gardener at Marlbrook Court, in Hertfordshire, had written to say that the conservatory frames had cracked in 3 places, and that the glazier's estimate was enclosed, and Isolde read the estimate, and, in the margin of the letter, in pencil so faint it could be rubbed away, drew a small diagram of a different frame that would not crack in the same 3 places. And she did not sign the diagram, because signing it would have been a claim she had not, in 4 years, learned how to make. She rubbed the diagram out before she put the letter on her uncle's desk. That, too, was familiar. The post brought 2 invitations, a bill and a letter for Isolde, in a hand she had not seen in a year. She recognized it before she read it, because a hand you have been taught to read as a child is a hand you recognize the way you recognize a voice. It was the hand of her father's old friend, Mr. Sylvester Aldous, editor of the almanac in which her article on the management of a country still-room had appeared under a name that was not hers. She took the letter to the window and broke the seal with a thumbnail that had, over 4 years, learned to break seals without leaving a mark on the paper. The letter was short. It said that Mr. Aldous had, at last, become aware of an error that had been perpetrated in his pages, that he had made enquiries and had established the truth that he intended to publish, in the next number of the almanac, a correction, and that he wished, before he did so, to know from Isolde herself whether she would prefer the correction to name her openly or to appear as a simple acknowledgment without a name attached. and that he would abide by her wish in the matter, but that he wished her to understand that he considered the correction to be a duty and would perform it in either case. He hoped she was well. He remembered her mother with affection. He was, always, her father's friend. Isolde read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her apron, beneath a scrap of ribbon that Perpetua had asked her to match at the haberdasher's later that morning. She stood at the window and looked at the frost on the railings and permitted herself, for the length of one breath, the small, dangerous warmth she had felt on the terrace the night before. She did not permit it to become anything else. She went upstairs to dress Perpetua. She did not yet know what she would answer Mr. Aldous. She did not yet know that the small letter in her apron pocket was the first weight on the correct side of a ledger she had been keeping, unwitting, for 4 years, and that a second weight and a third were even then on their way toward her along the slow gray road that winter had begun to lay down across the county. She only knew that the frost had come, and that the season the Duke of Ashenbury had named as the limit of her memory in the world had begun to turn, unhurried, toward the spring he had promised would forget her. By the following evening, the frost had deepened into something that would not lift before Christmas, and the drawing rooms of the county had begun to close their shutters at 4 and light their candles at 5, and the small society that considered itself the world had taken up its winter habit of gathering more often and in smaller rooms, so that a word spoken in one house at the beginning of a week might be repeated, with careful adjustment, in 6 houses by its end. Isolde had written, that morning, a short letter to Mr. Aldous. She had sat down at the writing desk in the morning room while the household was at prayers, and had drawn a sheet of the plainer paper toward her and had held the pen a moment above the page before she began. She had considered, in that moment, the several answers she might give. She had considered that a correction under her name would be a small public sentence in her favor, and would also be a small public sentence against her uncle's cousin, whose name had been placed above her work, and against her uncle, who had permitted the placing, and against her aunt, who would say, when she heard of it, that Isolde had made a spectacle of herself, and that spectacles were what one made when one did not have breeding enough to make anything else. She had considered that a correction without her name would spare her all of that, and would leave her, at the end, precisely where the almanac had left her, which was nowhere. She had written, in the end, a sentence she had not planned. She had written that she was grateful to Mr. Aldous for his kindness and his scruple, that she did not wish to inconvenience him or the almanac, but that if he intended to publish a correction at all, she would prefer that it be honest, and that honesty in the matter required her name. She had signed it Isolde Vane, and she had sealed it with the small plain wafer she kept in the drawer for her own use, and she had walked, herself, in the frost, before breakfast, to the receiving office at the corner of Cavendish Street and Bruton Place. And she had put the letter in with her own hand. She had not told anyone. She had come back to the house and taken off her bonnet, and gone upstairs and dressed Perpetua for a morning call, and Perpetua had not noticed that the hem of her gown was damp at the back where the frost had caught it, and Isolde had not mentioned it. Small things carry their own weight. She had begun, without meaning to lift one. That evening, the household was engaged for a private concert at the house of Lady Halberd, whose son had, by the pearled arithmetic of the ballroom 2 nights earlier, been placed beside Perpetua at supper, and had been discovered, at that supper, to prefer sonatas to symphonies, and to consider his opinion in the matter of general interest. It had therefore been arranged, with the speed at which such arrangements were made in the county, that a small concert would be given at Halberd House, that the sonata would be preferred, that Perpetua would be seated in the second row, where the light of the sconces fell most kindly on rose satin, and that Isolde would be somewhere at the back, where the light did not fall at all. Isolde had agreed to it as she had agreed to the other arrangements of the season, with the exact fraction of the head that manners required, and she had come down at the appointed hour in the gray wool remade, with new cuffs and a plain collar, because there was no other gown that was not also gray wool, and she had taken her place in the carriage at Perpetua's side. Lady Halbert's drawing room was a long, narrow room decorated in a pale green that had been fashionable when Lady Halbert was a bride and had not, in her opinion, ceased to be so. It smelled of beeswax, of a new fire in an old grate, of the faint tallow underlay of the sconces, of the powder of the older women along the wall, and of the abstract, unnameable something that any room takes on when it has decided in advance which of the guests within it will matter. Isolde was placed at the end of the third row, on a chair that had been added because a chair had to be found, and she was grateful to be at the end, because the end of a row is a small country of its own, and she had learned over 4 years to make her camp there. The performer was a young Italian who had been engaged at some expense and who played, as everyone agreed afterwards, with feeling. Isolde listened. She had, as a child, been given a fortnight of lessons on a harpsichord in her mother's back parlor, and she had learned enough in that fortnight to know what she was hearing, and to know, further, that she would not, in this house, be asked her opinion of it. She let the music do the small kind work that music does in such rooms, which was to give her something to attend to that did not attend, in turn to her. She was therefore not looking when the door opened again after the first movement, and a late arrival was quietly seated by a footman in a chair that had been kept at the end of the front row against just such a possibility. She heard, without turning, the small ripple of postures straightening along the front row, the small thinning of the lady's breath, the small dry laugh that Cressida Marlbrook, who was tonight in pale blue, permitted herself as she leaned to whisper to her mother. She did not need to turn to know who had come in. The room had told her. She kept her eyes on the young Italian. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She permitted herself, in the private country behind her face, one small exact thought, which was that the Duke of Ashenmere had not, in 4 years, attended a private concert at Halbert House, and that if he had chosen to attend one tonight, it was because he had chosen, and that a man of his exactness did not, in the ordinary way, choose without a reason. She refused, in the same private country, to name the reason. The music moved into the second movement. The Italian, encouraged by the front row, played a shade more slowly than he had played the first, and the sconces guttered in a small draught from the door. That had not been closed properly, and Isolde permitted herself, in the small, permitted way, to lift her eyes from the young Italian's hands to the row in front of her, and from the row in front of her to the row in front of that, and along that row to its end, where the late arrival sat with one gloved hand resting on the knee of his other leg, and his head inclined the exact fraction that attention required, and where his eyes, which had been on the Italian, moved, without seeming to move, to the end of the third row, and rested there a moment, and returned to the Italian, and did not, in the interval, alter the inclination of his head by so much as a hair. She looked down at her hands. She did not permit her face to change. She thought, with the small, clean edge of a truth she had not, in 4 years, permitted herself to think, that a man who could move his eyes across a room without moving his head was a man who had been trained to see without being seen to see, and that a woman who could receive such a look without being seen to receive it was, perhaps, a woman he had been looking at for longer than either of them had, so far, been willing to admit. She refused, again, to name the thought. She let the second movement finish. She joined, at its close, in the small polite applause the room permitted itself. She did not lift her eyes again until the interval, and when she lifted them then, It was only to observe that the front row had risen and was making its way, in careful order, toward the small table at the end of the room, where a footman was pouring the cold negus that would be drunk without pleasure by everyone in the room, and refilled without complaint by the same footman for the next hour. The Duke of Ashenbury had not risen. He remained in his chair, and when he turned it was not toward the negus, but toward the third row, and he rose then, and moved along the wall with the unhurried economy of a man who has decided where he is going, and does not need to be observed on his way. And he arrived at the end of the third row, and stood beside Isolde's chair, and inclined his head. "Miss Vane," he said. "Quietly, your grace," she said, and rose as manners required, and the room, which had not been looking, was looking now, in the way rooms look without appearing to. "There is," he said in the same quiet voice, "a small landscape in the anteroom that Lady Halberd has been telling me for a quarter of an hour I ought to admire. I do not care to admire it alone. Will you do me the kindness of accompanying me?" It was not a request that could be refused without being a different kind of statement. Isolde had learned over 4 years to read the exact weight of the requests that could not be refused, and she read this one and knew it for what it was, which was a courtesy so precisely constructed that to refuse it would have insulted not the Duke, who could bear insult without noticing, but Lady Halberd, who could not. She inclined her head. "I should be glad, your grace." She did not look at Cressida Marlbrook, who was at that moment at the negus table laughing the pearled laugh. She did not look at Perpetua, who was at that moment at the negus table, discovering that she had left her fan on the chair. She did not look at her aunt, who was at that moment at the negus table, calculating in the small dry chamber at the back of her mind whether the sentence she was watching cost her more than it cost her niece. She walked with the Duke of Ashenbury along the wall to the anteroom, and the room's eyes went with them the whole length of it, and she felt them go, and she did not permit her step to change. The anteroom was small and papered in a green a shade darker than the drawing-room, and there was, on the wall opposite the door, a landscape in a heavy gilt frame that had been painted by a competent hand in the last century and had hung in that room ever since. The Duke of Ashenbury stood before it, at the exact distance a painting of that size required, and he did not look at it. "I do not," he said, "care for this landscape. I do not think Lady Halberd cares for it either. It is here, because it was here when she came into the house, and it will be here when she goes out of it, and it has, so far as I can tell, no other reason to exist. Forgive me for using it as an errand. It is a very useful landscape, your grace," Isolde said, before she could stop herself. He inclined his head. There was, at the corner of his mouth, the faintest possible movement. "Useful," he said. She heard the word arrive between them with the small, dry weight it always arrived with in the county, and she heard him give it back to her without the weight, as a man returns a coin that had been slipped into his palm by a stranger who mistook him for someone else. "You use the word carefully," he said. "I have been taught to use it carefully, your grace." "By whom?" She looked at him then. He met the look. He did not linger over it. "By people," she said, "who have found the word useful." "Ah," he said. He turned at last toward the painting and considered it for the length of time that courtesy required, and then he turned away from it and back toward her, and he said, in the same quiet voice, "Miss Vane, I have come tonight, in some part, because I wish to speak with you again, and I have used Lady Halberd's landscape as I have used it, because a man in my position may not, without consequence, ask a young woman for the courtesy of a quarter of an hour of conversation in a room in which the eyes of the county are looking for reasons. I am, in this, using you as well. I am aware of it. I would prefer to be honest about it, than to be graceful about it, if you will permit the preference." She considered him. She considered the sentence. She considered the small, dangerous warmth she had refused, on the terrace, to permit to become anything else, and she considered that it had, in spite of her, become something else, and that the something else had a shape now, and that the shape stood in an anteroom at Halbert House, with one gloved hand on the frame of a landscape it did not care for. She said, quietly, "You may prefer honesty, Your Grace. I have found it more affordable than grace, when one has the choice. Have you often had the choice? No. Your Grace. Then you have paid, more than once, for a grace you did not want. One pays for what the household needs, Your Grace, not for what one wants." She heard, again, the small, clean edge of a truth she had not meant to give him. She waited, again, for the sentence to be resented. It was not. He inclined his head. "Miss Vane," he said, "I do not know how long the interval at Lady Halbert's concert is customary to last, but I know it is not long enough to say what I would prefer to say to you, and I know further that any attempt to say it here would be reported before the sonata resumes. Will you permit me, tomorrow, to call at Cavendish Street on a matter of household business your uncle has been avoiding, and to speak, in the 10 minutes that such a call permits, of something that is not business? My uncle avoids many matters of business, Your Grace. I know. I have made it my habit, over the last week, to know." She looked at him. She did not, in that moment, know what to make of the sentence. She resolved to make of it, later, only what her ledger permitted. "You may call, Your Grace." "Thank you." He inclined his head. He offered his arm, the exact fraction that courtesy required, and she took it, the exact fraction her hand knew how to take, and they returned along the wall to the drawing room, and the room's eyes came back to them and went with them to their chairs. And no one in the drawing room, that evening, spoke to Isolde a sentence that had not been spoken to her before. And no one, either, spoke to the Duke of Ashenbury a sentence he had not been spoken to before. And yet, by the end of the second half of the concert, everyone in the room knew that a sentence had been added to the county's small, unwritten book, and the sentence was that the Duke of Ashenbury had, at Halbert House, in the interval of a private concert, walked a girl in grey wool to an anteroom to admire a landscape neither of them cared for, and that neither of them had, on the way back, appeared to be a person who had wasted a quarter of an hour. Cressida Marlbrook did not laugh the pearled laugh again for the rest of the evening. She smiled a different smile, one that had a small dry weight of its own. And she carried the smile home in the carriage and up the stairs to her mother's dressing room, and there, before the fire, she permitted it, at last, to become the sentence it had been all evening. "The little cousin," she said, "will need to be reminded, I think, of how kindly we have all been." Her mother, unpinning her hair, said nothing. Silence was, in that dressing room, a form of consent, and Cressida had learned, at 15, to hear it. The Duke of Ashenbury called at Cavendish Street the following morning at 11, which was the exact hour at which a man of his standing might call, without being early and without being late. He was received by Lord Marlbrook in the library, and he spoke with Lord Marlbrook for a quarter of an hour on the matter of a canal in which Lord Marlbrook held a small, unremembered interest, and he asked, at the end of the quarter of an hour, whether he might pay his respects to Lady Marlbrook and to the young ladies before he left, and Lord Marlbrook, who had been asleep for the last 3 minutes of the canal, said that of course he might, and rang. He was received by Lady Marlbrook and Perpetua in the morning room, and he spoke with them for the 10 minutes that a call of that kind permitted, and he was, in that 10 minutes, exact in his courtesies, unhurried in his questions, and precise in his refusals of the small conversational traps that Lady Marlbrook, without meaning to, laid in his path. Isolde was not, at first, in the room. She had been in the room until the moment the Duke was announced, and she had risen, with the exact fraction of the head that manners required, and had gone to fetch the small tray of biscuits that the morning room kept in a cupboard for callers, and she had taken longer than the errand required, because she had discovered, in the passage, that her hands were unsteady, and she had waited until they were steady again, and then she had come back. She entered the morning room with the tray. The Duke of Auchenmary rose. Lady Marlbrook, who had not risen for a woman in her own house in 20 years, inclined her head. Perpetua smiled the small, careful smile she had been taught. "Ah," Lady Marlbrook said, in the tone of a woman who had been about to mention a thing and was pleased to find it already at hand, "my niece. Isolde, my dear, come, sit. His Grace has been so kind as to call on my husband about the canal, and has been so very kind as to inquire after us all before he left." Isolde curtsied. The Duke inclined his head. He resumed his seat. She resumed hers. Perpetua, at her mother's small signal, drew the conversation neatly toward the sonata, and the sonata was praised, and the young Italian was praised, and Lady Halberd was praised, and the small landscape in the anteroom was not mentioned, because the small landscape in the anteroom had been mentioned enough already in every drawing-room in the county, and did not require further attention in this one. The Duke let the sonata be praised. He accepted a biscuit. He addressed his next question to Isolde. "Miss Vane," he said, "I have been told since I saw you last that you have some skill at the drawing of gardens, and that a design of yours is to be seen at Marlbrook Court, though not, I understand, under your name." The room, which had been warm, cooled a degree. Perpetua's small, careful smile did not change, and cost her, in the not changing, a small, unseen effort that Isolde saw. Lady Marlbrook's hand, which had been at the handle of the teapot, remained at the handle of the teapot, and did not, for a moment, do anything. Lord Marlbrook, in the doorway, coughed. "Your Grace is very kind," Isolde said, and did not, in the sentence, either confirm the design or deny it, because either would have been a sentence with consequences, and she had learned, over 4 years, to hand no one a sentence with consequences until she knew who would carry the weight of it. "I am not, in general, kind, Miss Vane," the Duke said, quietly. "I am only exact. Exactness, in my experience, is often mistaken for kindness by people who have not received much of either. I asked because I have, on my own land in the north, a small conservatory that has cracked in the same 3 places for 4 winters in a row, and the man who has been rebuilding it has, 4 times, rebuilt it the same way, and I have been considering, since I heard of your design, whether I might beg the loan of it, with the permission of its author, for the 5th attempt." He did not look at Lord Marlbrook. He did not look at Lady Marlbrook. He looked at Isolde. Isolde looked at her hands, and then at him. "Your Grace," she said, quietly, "any design I have made is at your Grace's disposal. I would ask only that it be, in the copying, honest," she heard, again, the small, clean edge of a truth she had not planned to give. She heard, on the other side of the room, her aunt's breath draw in and out again. She heard, on the other side of that, the Duke of Auchenmary permit himself, for the second time in her hearing, the small movement at the corner of his mouth. "Honest," he said. "Yes, I have grown fond of that word, Miss Vane, in the last week. I shall be honest as I copy. You have my word." He rose. He took his leave. He was, in his taking of it, exact. He inclined his head to Lady Marlbrook, to Perpetua, to Isolde, in that order, and each inclination was the exact fraction the woman had earned. He was gone. The room, when the door had closed behind him, held its breath for the length of time it takes a fire to shift in its grate. Then Lady Marlbrook set the teapot down, without pouring, and said, in a voice that had not, that morning, been heard in that room before, "Isolde, my dear, you will oblige me by explaining what design in a garden the Duke of Ashenmere has been told of, and by whom?" Isolde folded her hands. She had, in the moment before the sentence, made her small decision. She had made it not in defiance, because defiance was a currency she did not yet have to spend, but in the small, clean recognition that the ledger she had been keeping had been altered, in the last quarter of an hour, in a way that could not be altered back, and that pretending otherwise would only cost her more later. The design for the conservatory at Marlbrook Court, Aunt, she said, which I drew last winter and left on the writing desk in the morning room. I did not know it had been sent to the gardener under any hand. I have not spoken of it to anyone. You have not spoken of it, Lady Marlbrook repeated. No, Aunt, and yet the Duke of Ashenmere has heard of it. I do not know how. You do not know how. No, Aunt, Lady Marlbrook considered her niece. The consideration took a length of time that Perpetua, at her mother's side, spent examining the biscuit in her hand as though the biscuit had, on it, a small piece of writing that would explain everything. You will not, Lady Marlbrook said, at last, speak of this again, Isolde, to any person. You will not, when the Duke's man comes for the design, present the design in your own name. You will present it in your uncle's name, as it has been presented, and you will make no remark on the matter to his grace or to any other person. Am I understood? Isolde looked at her hands. She thought of the letter she had put in the receiving office 2 mornings before. She thought of the correction that was, at that moment, being set in type in a small printing house near the Strand. She thought of the 8 words on the scrap of paper in the locket at her throat. She thought that she had already, without meaning to, answered the question her aunt had just asked, and that any answer she gave now would be smaller than the answer she had already given. I understand you, Aunt, she said, quietly, and did not add that understanding a sentence was not the same as agreeing to it. Lady Marlbrook, who had been trained to hear only the first half of such sentences, was satisfied. She poured the tea. Perpetua ate the biscuit. Lord Marlbrook, in the doorway, went back to the library, where the canal was waiting. The frost held. The county entered its short, bright winter. The Duke of Ashenmere called twice more at Cavendish Street in the fortnight that followed, each time on a matter of business, each time exact, each time managing, in the 10 minutes that such a call permitted, to address one question to Isolde on a subject that no one else in the room could answer for her, and each time she answered him with the exact fraction her ledger permitted. The county's small unwritten book acquired a second sentence, and a third. The pearled laugh at Cressida Marlbrook's throat grew a small, dry weight of its own. Lady Marlbrook did not, again, mention the design. She had begun, instead, to mention other things. She mentioned, one evening at supper, that a young woman in Isolde's position ought to be very grateful for the kindnesses shown her, and ought, in return, to be very careful of the reputations of those who had shown them. She mentioned, another morning at breakfast, that a woman without settlement or standing was, in the eyes of the world, a woman whose reputation was the only thing she had, and that a woman who spent that reputation carelessly would find at the end that she had spent it all. She mentioned, a third time, that gossip, once loosed, could not be recalled, and that it was therefore incumbent on a woman in Isolde's position to give no cause for gossip, however slight, because the world was not a place that measured slightness accurately. Isolde received each mention with the exact fraction of the head that manners required. She did not answer any of them. She knew, in the small, quiet chamber at the back of her mind, that her aunt was laying the ground for a sentence her aunt intended, at some later date, to speak, and she waited in the same chamber for the sentence to arrive. It arrived in a form her aunt had not planned, on the morning of the 4th of December, in the shape of a letter delivered to Lord Marlbrook by a man who had not given his name. Lord Marlbrook read the letter in the library. He read it twice. He rang for his wife. Lady Marlbrook came and read the letter and did not, for a long moment, do anything, and then she rang for Isolde. Isolde came. She saw, in the small dry set of her aunt's mouth, that the sentence had arrived. She saw, in the small worried set of her uncle's brow, that the sentence had arrived from a direction her uncle had not expected. She saw, on the desk between them, a letter written on paper heavier than the paper Mr. Aldous used, in a hand she did not recognize, and she saw, at the bottom of the letter, no signature at all. "Isolde," Lord Marlbrook said, "without looking up, there has come to me this morning a letter. I do not know from whom. It contains, in its first paragraph, a set of accusations against you, of a kind I would rather not read aloud in this room. It contains, in its second, a threat that these accusations will be laid before the Duke of Ashenmurray within the week, and, further, before Her Majesty's household, at the next drawing-room, unless certain arrangements are made. I do not intend to make the arrangements. I intend, first, to ask you whether there is, in the accusations, any truth." He handed her the letter. She read it. The letter said, in careful, courteous phrases arranged for maximum injury, that Miss Isolde Vane, the niece of Lord Marlbrook, had for the past 4 years conducted a private correspondence with a gentleman not of her family, that the correspondence had begun in her 17th year while she was still in mourning for her father, that it had been continued in the years since under the cover of household errands, that letters in her hand were in the possession of the writer, and that these letters would be laid before the Duke of Ashenmurray, whose recent attentions to Miss Vane were, the writer regretted to say, based upon a misapprehension of her character, unless Miss Vane withdrew, quietly and at once, from all further society in which the Duke of Ashenmurray might be expected to be found. The letter was undated. It was written in a hand that leaned very slightly backward, in the way a hand leans when it has been trained to lean forward and is being asked, in the moment of writing, to disguise itself. It used, in its second paragraph, the phrase incumbent upon a young woman, which was a phrase Isolde had heard, at breakfast, at supper, and at 3 morning calls spoken in her aunt's voice. It used, in its third paragraph, the phrase reputations of those who have shown kindness, which was a phrase she had heard, at supper the previous week, spoken in Cressida Marlbrook's voice, pearled and small. And it referred, in its opening line, to the correspondence as having begun in the summer of the year Isolde had turned 17, and to a letter written by her, in that summer, from the house at Ashfield Row. Isolde read the letter twice. She folded it. She set it, gently, on the desk. She looked at her uncle. "There is not, in these accusations, any truth, uncle," she said, quietly. "I have written no such letters. I have conducted no such correspondence. I am not the woman this letter describes. You will forgive me, Isolde," Lord Marlbrook said, "if I ask you to say so a second time." "I have written no such letters," Isolde said. "I have conducted no such correspondence. I am not the woman this letter describes." Lady Marlbrook, who had been at the window, turned. "It is very easy, Isolde," she said, quietly, "to say a thing twice. It is not so easy to prove it. Whoever has written this letter has, they say, letters in your hand. If they produce them, my dear, what shall we say then?" Isolde looked at her aunt. She looked, for the length of one breath, at the small dry set of her aunt's mouth, and she saw, in it, not the astonishment of a woman who has been surprised by a scandal in her house, but the composed attention of a woman who has been waiting, for some time, to see how a scandal in her house would be received. She looked away. She would not, in that room, in that morning, permit the sentence in her mind to move her mouth. She had, over 4 years, learned the exact fraction of the head that manners required, and she had learned, also, the exact fraction of the tongue that survival required, and she used them both. If they produce letters, Aunt, she said, they will produce letters I have not written. I do not know what more to say. I ask only that, before any arrangement is made on the strength of an unsigned letter, the letters they claim to hold be shown to me, and be shown to my uncle, and be shown to any person of judgment my uncle chooses to consult, and be examined, honestly, against what is known of my hand and of my life these 4 years past. Your hand, Lord Marlbrook said, slowly, and of your life these 4 years past. Yes, uncle. He looked at his wife. His wife looked at the window. He looked, at last, at his niece. That, he said, is not an unreasonable request, Isolde. Lady Marlbrook did not turn from the window. It is not, my dear, she said quietly, a matter of what is reasonable. It is a matter of what is prudent. A young woman in Isolde's position, if she has been the subject of such a letter, has already, whether or not the letter is true, been damaged. The world does not distinguish. It is incumbent upon us to protect the family. It is incumbent upon Isolde, if she has any regard for those who have shown her kindness, to withdraw quietly from society for a season, to spare us all a public matter, and to allow the letter and the writer to go unremarked. That is my counsel. That is your counsel, Lord Marlbrook said, and I have heard it. I shall consider it. Isolde, you will oblige me by remaining in the house this morning. I shall write to my brother-in-law, Sir Adrian Vane, at Ashfield Hall, and ask him to come up to town by the first coach. Lady Marlbrook turned then. Adrian? She said. Adrian is in the country. Adrian will not travel in this frost. Adrian is my wife's brother, Lord Marlbrook said, and my niece's uncle by marriage, and, more to the present purpose, the executor of my niece's father's estate, and the man who has known her hand and her character since she was in the schoolroom. If a letter of this kind is to be answered, Adrian shall answer it. I shall write today. Isolde did not, in that room, in that morning, permit her face to change. She curtsied. She left the library. She went upstairs to her own room at the top of the back stair. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She unfastened the locket at her throat and opened it. She read the 8 words on the scrap of paper. She did not, that morning, say them aloud. She said, instead, the small addendum that had begun to attach itself to the sentence over the last 6 weeks, since the almanac had appeared and been turned face down and put away, and the addendum was, and sometimes other people's, and one day, perhaps, one's own. She looked at the addendum. She had suspected, on the terrace at Marlbrook House, that it was both hope and warning. She saw, now, that it was neither, and that it was something a great deal simpler, which was a decision. She closed the locket. She went down. Sir Adrian Vane arrived at Cavendish Street on the evening of the 6th of December, 3 days later than Lord Marlbrook had expected him, and 1 day earlier than the frost had permitted anyone else to travel. He came in the plain black traveling coat he had worn for 20 years, and the plain black hat that had been made for him in the year of Isolde's mother's marriage, and had not, in his opinion, ceased to be adequate. He was a lean, dry, upright man of 63, with a mouth that had been taught, by long practice, to permit itself only the smallest of movements, and eyes that had been taught, by longer practice, to see more than they permitted themselves to say. He was Isolde's mother's elder brother. He had believed her mother, in every matter, for the whole of her life. He had believed her father in most matters for the length of the acquaintance. He was, in the small, quiet chamber at the back of Isolde's mind, the one person in the county whose belief she had never doubted, and whose belief she had come to see over the last 3 days was the one thing she had been unable, in 4 years, to ask for, because asking would have meant admitting there was cause. He was received in the library. He did not remove his hat until Lord Marlbrook removed his own. He listened, without interrupting, while Lord Marlbrook read the letter aloud. He listened, without interrupting, while Lady Marlbrook, at the window, offered her counsel a second time. He waited, when both had finished, for the length of time it takes a fire to shift twice in its grate. Then he said, quietly, "Where is Isolde?" She was sent for. She came. She stood in the doorway a moment, and she saw, in the lean, dry, upright shape of her Uncle Adrian, the first sentence in 3 days that did not require her to prepare an answer. She curtsied. He inclined his head. "Come in, child," he said, and closed the door. She came in and closed the door. "Give me the letter," he said. He read it. He read it slowly. He read it a second time. He set it on the desk. He looked at his sister, at the window, and at his brother-in-law, in the chair, and then at Isolde. "This letter," he said, "was not written by a person who knew my niece. It refers, in its opening line, to a correspondence begun in the summer of her 17th year, from the house at Ashfield Row. My niece did not live at Ashfield Row in the summer of her 17th year. She lived, in that summer, with me at Ashfield Hall from the 14th of May until the 3rd of October, at which point she came up to town to her aunt and uncle here. The house at Ashfield Row had been closed and its contents removed on the 2nd of May. There was, in that summer, no writing desk at Ashfield Row, no ink at Ashfield Row, and no Isolde at Ashfield Row from which any letter could have been written. Whoever composed this document was working from a general knowledge of my niece's history and did not trouble to check a date. There it is. He tapped the paper with one dry finger. One anomaly. It undoes the whole. He turned to Lord Marlbrook. The letter is a forgery. The accusations are a fabrication. The threat is, in its nature, the threat of a person who does not intend, and probably cannot, produce what they claim to hold. Whoever they are, they have overreached. They have written a document that any person who knew my niece in her 17th year could disprove with a calendar. I am such a person. So are 3 of my servants at Ashfield Hall. So is the vicar at Ashfield, in whose parish my niece was confirmed that summer. So is Mr. Sylvester Aldous of the Almanac, who was our guest for a fortnight in July. I will, if it is required, produce them all. Lady Marlbrook, at the window, did not turn. Lord Marlbrook, in the chair, breathed out. Slowly, "Adrian," he said, "I am grateful." "You are welcome to be grateful, Marlbrook," Sir Adrian said, "when you have done what remains to be done, which is to write, this evening, to His Grace the Duke of Auchenmere, and to place before him, plainly, the letter, my testimony, and the calendar. He is not a man who will act on an unsigned page. He is also not a man to whom one leaves an unsigned page unaddressed. You will write. I shall attend you while you do." He turned to Isolde. He inclined his head. "Child," he said, "you have carried a great deal for a long time, and I have seen only a little of it, because you have been careful that I should see only a little. I ask your forgiveness for the little I did not see. From this hour I see, and I stand where I am asked. Sit down. You are pale." She sat. She did not, in that room, permit her face to change. She permitted, in the private country behind it, one small exact thought, which was that her mother had, in her lifetime, believed her brother in every matter, and that she, Isolde, had in her own lifetime been believed by him in every matter for as long as he had been asked to believe her, and that the ledger she had been keeping had been altered in the last 5 minutes by a weight so heavy on the correct side that she did not, for a moment, know how to sit with it. Small things carry their own weight. Some of them, she thought, carry other people's, and some of them, once in a lifetime, are laid down for one by another hand. Lord Marlbrook wrote. Sir Adrian dictated. The letter was short. It set out, in exact language, the letter that had been received, the testimony of Sir Adrian Vane on the whereabouts of his niece in the summer of her 17th year, and the standing offer of any further testimony his Grace might require. It was sealed with Lord Marlbrook's own seal. It was sent, by Sir Adrian's man, to the house on Grosvenor Square that night. The Duke of Ashenbury received the letter at 10:30. He read it in the room with the one candle. He read it twice. He drew toward him the small ledger bound in dark leather. He turned to the page on which, some weeks earlier, he had written 3 words at the top and nothing beneath. He wrote, beneath the 3 words, in the exact hand he had been taught by a tutor 30 years dead, a single sentence, and closed the ledger and put it away. He did not, that night, write a reply to Cavendish Street. He wrote, instead, a note of 2 lines to Sir Adrian Vane at his hotel, requesting the honor of an interview at 8 the following morning. He sent it by his own man. He extinguished the candle. He sat for a quarter of an hour in the dark, considering what he intended at 8 the following morning to say, and what he intended thereafter to do. He did not permit himself, in the dark, to consider what he intended thereafter to feel. That, he had been taught, was a matter one attended to when the other matters were arranged. At 8 the following morning, Sir Adrian Vane was received in the small library on the ground floor of the house on Grosvenor Square. The interview lasted 40 minutes. What was said in it was not, at the time, repeated to any other person, but the shape of what had been said became visible in the days that followed, in the small, careful movements that began to occur across the county. A gentleman of Sir Adrian's acquaintance called at the printing house near the Strand and requested a small correction to the next number of the almanac, which was granted. A second gentleman of the Duke's acquaintance called at a stationer's in Bond Street and made enquiry about a particular weight of paper and received an answer that pleased him. A third gentleman, whom neither Sir Adrian nor the Duke knew personally, but whom both had reason to trust, called at the receiving office in Cavendish Street and asked, courteously, whether a letter of a certain description had been posted from that office on a certain date, and received an answer that did not please him, and, an hour later, at a second receiving office, asked the same question, and received an answer that did. On the afternoon of the 9th of December, a small note was delivered to Cavendish Street from Grosvenor Square. It was addressed to Lord Marlbrook. It informed him, in exact language, that the letter of the 4th had been considered, that its author had been, in the Duke's opinion, identified with a degree of certainty that would permit action if action were desired, and that the Duke of Ashenbury intended, for reasons of his own, to take no immediate action beyond the private noting of the fact, but that he wished to inform Lord Marlbrook, as head of the household in which Miss Vane resided, that any further document of a similar kind, from any hand, would be treated as an actionable matter without further warning. The note was read by Lord Marlbrook in the library, and by Lady Marlbrook at his shoulder, and by Sir Adrian in the chair opposite, and by Isolde standing at the window. No one in the library spoke for a quarter of a minute after the note had been read. Then Sir Adrian said, quietly, "That is well." Lord Marlbrook nodded. Lady Marlbrook, at the window, said nothing. Isolde, from her place, turned, "Uncle," she said to Sir Adrian. "I should like, if I may, to write a short note of thanks to His Grace." "It is not a matter of grace. It is a matter of honesty. I would prefer to be honest about it than to be graceful about it, if you will permit the preference." Sir Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head. "You may write, child," he said. "Grace and honesty are not always opposed. I have found it useful, in a long life, to know which of the two a matter requires. In this matter, honesty is required. Write it." She wrote it. It was 3 sentences long. It thanked the Duke of Ashenmire for the exactness of his attention, for the reserve of his action, and for the courtesy of his note. It said nothing else. It was signed Isolde Vane. It was sent by Sir Adrian's man to Grosvenor Square. That evening, in the room with the one candle, the Duke of Ashenmire read the note twice. He drew toward him the small ledger bound in dark leather. He turned to the page on which he had written 3 words, and then, later, a single sentence. He wrote, beneath the sentence, a second sentence, and closed the ledger and put it away. He sat, for a quarter of an hour, in the dark. He did not, that night, extinguish the candle himself. The candle did that, in its own time, without asking his permission. On the 10th of December, the frost broke. A wind came in from the west that had, in it, the smell of rain from a long way off, and the rooks in the plane trees along Cavendish Street rose in a black wheel and settled again, and the gutters ran, for the first time in a fortnight, with water. On the 11th, the rain came. It came slowly at first, and then heavily, and it did not stop for a day and a night, and the small society that considered itself the world moved its winter habit indoors, and closed its shutters at 3, and lit its candles at 4, and gathered, more often and in smaller rooms than it had gathered even in the frost. On the evening of the 12th, Isolde received, at Cavendish Street, a note in a hand she had by now, without meaning to, learned to recognize. It was from the Duke of Ashenmire. It was addressed to her, in her own name, at Cavendish Street, and it had been sent deliberately in the open post, so that any person in the household who wished to remark upon it would be obliged to remark that the Duke of Ashenmire had, in the open post, written to Miss Isolde Vane. It said that His Grace had, on the following evening, an engagement at a small private house near Cavendish Square, at which certain persons of the household in which Miss Vane resided were also engaged, and at which it was likely that a matter would be raised, in the course of the evening, which Miss Vane herself had a right to hear, and to answer before any other person. It said that His Grace would find, at that evening, an opportunity to speak with Miss Vane in a room away from the general company, that the room had been arranged for with the master of the house, and that his host had consented on the understanding that no impropriety would attach to the arrangement. It said that His Grace begged Miss Vane's pardon for the presumption of the request, that he would not have made it in any lesser matter, and that he awaited, without pressure, whatever answer she chose to give. It was signed only with his initial. Isolde read the note in her own room, at the top of the back stair, by the light of the single candle she permitted herself in the evenings. She read it twice. She folded it. She placed it, gently, inside the locket at her throat, beneath the curl of pale hair and the scrap of paper on which her mother's 8 words leaned forward as if to keep walking. She sat, for a long moment, on the edge of the narrow bed, and she permitted herself, for the first time in 4 years in Marlbrook House, to feel the small, dangerous warmth she had refused, on the terrace, to permit to become anything else, and she did not, this evening, refuse it. She lifted her face, and she closed her eyes, and she drew, once, a slow breath in and out, and outside her window, in the mews, the rain came down without hurry on the roofs of the stables, and inside her window, In the small, clean chamber at the back of her mind, a decision that had been waiting 4 years for its hour stood up quietly and put on its coat. The following evening arrived beneath a sky that had not all day quite made up its mind, and the small private house near Cavendish Square, when the carriages began to draw up at its door a little after 8, stood at the end of its street under a low ceiling of cloud that promised, without hurry, to become a storm before the night was out. It belonged to a Colonel Erasmus Holliday, a friend of Sir Adrian Vane's from a long-ago regiment, a widower of quiet habits, who had opened his rooms twice a year for the last 20 years and had, in that time, contrived to gather at his fires exactly the persons who most interested him, and none who did not. His rooms were arranged along the length of the first floor, 3 of them opening into one another with folding doors, and beyond them a smaller room at the back, paneled in a dark wood that had been dark before Colonel Holliday had been born, and had grown darker since, in which the colonel kept a small library and a fire that was lit only on the evenings he chose to light it. Isolde came in on Sir Adrian's arm. She had dressed, at Sir Adrian's quiet request, in a gown he had sent from the modiste in Hanover Street that afternoon, of a gray so pale it was almost silver, cut with a plain collar and unornamented cuffs, and she had accepted it with the exact fraction of the head that gratitude required, and no more, because she had learned, over 4 years, that a gift accepted with too many words became, later, a debt too heavy to carry. She wore, at her throat, the small oval locket of dulled silver on the ribbon that had been washed too often to remember itself, and inside the locket the curl of pale hair the color of winter wheat, and the scrap of paper with the 8 words, and, folded once, the note in the hand she had learned to recognize. She had not left the note in her room. She had, all day, thought that she might, and she had, at the last, put it where she put the things she did not intend to lose. Lord Marlbrook was in the second room, at cards. Lady Marlbrook was in the first, at tea. Perpetua was between them, and Rose sat in the color of a confection that had been left too long in a warm window, being introduced, at her mother's small signal, to the persons her mother had come to introduce her to. Cressida Marlbrook, in pale blue, was at the far end of the first room, with her own mother, and the pearled laugh had been at her throat when Isolde entered, and had, at the sight of her, gone still. Isolde inclined her head to those who inclined theirs to her. She did not seek any face. She felt, without seeking it, the moment at which the Duke of Ashenmerry entered the room, because the room told her. He came in from the stair with the unhurried economy of a man who had not, in his life, arrived anywhere in a hurry, and he greeted his host, and he greeted Sir Adrian, and he greeted Lord Marlbrook at the card table, and he greeted Lady Marlbrook at the tea, and he greeted Perpetua at her mother's side, and he did not, in the greeting of any of them, permit his eyes to travel past the person he was addressing. It was Cressida Marlbrook who forced the matter. She had, that day, made her calculation, and the calculation had produced a sentence, and she had come to Colonel Halliday's for the sole purpose of speaking it. She crossed the first room on the pretense of admiring the tea cakes and paused, on the pretense of the pause, beside Sir Adrian and Isolde, and she smiled the smile that had, for a fortnight, been carrying a small dry weight of its own. "Miss Vane," she said, "how well you look this evening. That gray is very fine." One must admire the ingenuity of a young woman who can make one gown do the service of many. The words sounded affectionate, the pressure underneath them was not. Sir Adrian did not turn his head. Isolde inclined hers the exact fraction that manners required. "You are very kind, Miss Marlbrook," she said. "Ingenuity is, I have found, cheaper than variety, and it lasts longer." "How useful," Cressida said, and let the word rest between them for the length of a breath. and then said, still smiling, though I confess I had heard, only this morning, a strange rumor concerning a letter, and I could hardly believe it, and I was so glad to see you here tonight, dear, in perfect spirits, so that I might tell everyone, when they ask me, that of course it was nothing. She had pitched the sentence precisely at the volume of the small room, and 3 heads at the tea table and 2 at the card table turned. It was not loud enough to be a threat. It was not quiet enough to be safe. Sir Adrian permitted himself, for the first time that evening, a small movement at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the movement of a man who has been waiting, without impatience, to be handed a particular sentence, and has been handed it. Miss Marlbrook, he said, quietly, I do not know what rumor you have heard, but if it is the rumor I suspect it is, I shall be able, before the evening is out, to tell you a great deal about it. In the meantime, my niece is not the person to whom you should address your relief. She is the person to whom, if any relief is owed at all, an apology is. Cressida's smile did not, at once, alter. It remained upon her mouth for the length of time it takes a small, clever animal to understand that the door it has walked through has closed behind it. Then it altered. The Duke of Ashenbury, without seeming to move, was at Sir Adrian's shoulder. Sir Adrian, he said, quietly, Colonel Holiday has been kind enough to permit me the use of his back room for a quarter of an hour. I have a matter to lay before Miss Vane, and, with your permission, before yourself. Will you both do me the honor? It was not a question. It was never a question. He offered his arm, the exact fraction that courtesy required, and Isolde placed her hand upon it, the exact fraction her hand knew how to place, and Sir Adrian, behind them, inclined his head to Cressida Marlbrook, precisely the fraction she had earned, and followed. The back room was small, paneled in the dark wood, warm with a fire that had been laid by Colonel Holiday's own hand, and lit by 2 candles on the mantel-shelf and no others. The rain, which had begun somewhere in the west during the afternoon, had at that moment arrived over the roofs of Cavendish Square, and it struck the single tall window at the end of the room with the sudden, unapologetic force of a weather that had at last decided what it wished to be. Colonel Holiday, who had been at the window, inclined his head to them, drew the heavy curtain 3/4 across the glass, and withdrew. The door closed behind him. It did not, quite, close all the way. Colonel Holiday was, in the small, careful chamber at the back of his mind, a friend to Sir Adrian Vane and to no other person in the house that night, and the door had been left as it had been left on purpose. The Duke of Ashenbury released Isolde's hand at the mantel-shelf. He did not sit. He turned to Sir Adrian. Sir Adrian, he said, I asked that you attend because what I have to say to your niece ought to be said, in the first instance, in the hearing of the person she trusts most in this county. I do not ask you to speak. I ask you to listen. If, at any point, you judge that I have overstepped, you will oblige me by saying so, and I shall stop. Sir Adrian inclined his head. He drew a chair a little way from the fire and sat, and he did not look at Isolde, because he had learned, in a long life, that a young woman who is about to be spoken to is often best spared the small addition of a familiar eye. He looked at the fire. The Duke turned to Isolde. He did not, for a moment, speak. He was, in that moment, at the far side of the small room, the length of a small rug and a chair between them, and the distance was, in the small ledger at the back of Isolde's mind, precisely the distance a duke would keep from a niece of Lord Marlbrook in the back room of a colonel's house at 9 o'clock in the evening, while a storm broke over the square. He crossed a portion of it. He stopped. He was, now, at the edge of the rug. He spoke. Miss Vane, he said, and his voice was quiet. "I said a sentence some weeks ago in a ballroom at Marlbrook House that I would not have said had I known you stood within hearing. I have, since then, said a number of other sentences, in a number of other rooms, that I would say again, in your hearing, gladly. I have come, tonight, to say to you the sentences I have not yet permitted myself to say in any room at all." He crossed another portion of the distance. He stopped again. He was, now, within the length of an arm. He did not lift the arm. "I did not come to this because you are beautiful," he said, "though you are, in a way that this county does not have the wit to see. I did not come to this because you are useful, though the word has been laid on you in every drawing room in the county for 4 years, and I have, in the last 6 weeks, seen with my own eyes the small unnoticed offices you perform in every room you enter, and I could tonight list them for an hour and not exhaust the list. I did not come to this because it would please anyone, and I am aware, more than most, that it will please almost no one. I came because, the first evening on the terrace at Marlbrook House, I was permitted to see, in the space of 1 sentence, that a woman had answered me with the truth I had not earned, and I have not, since, been able to be in a room with you and not know it. I came because you have, every time I have seen you, refused to give the county what the county has taught you to give, and have given, instead, what your mother, whoever she was, taught you to give, and I have found, in that refusal and in that giving, the only thing I have wanted in a long life to find. I came because I have looked at you, in a ballroom and in a concert room, and in a morning room, and in a library, and I have known, each time, that if the room emptied of every other person, the room would still contain everything I have any use for. That is why I have come." He did not, in the speaking, raise his voice by so much as a hair. He spoke as a man speaks when he has, at last, decided that the shape of a sentence matters less than the fact of it. His voice, in the speaking, shed the small dry edge of authority it had carried in every other room she had heard him speak in, and became, instead, only the voice of a man who had, for 4 years, been walking without knowing that he had been walking toward this small back room, and who had, at last arrived. Isolde stood by the mantel-shelf. She had, in the private country behind her face, made her small decision 3 nights before, in her own room at the top of the back stair, when she had folded the note and placed it in the locket. She made it now again, aloud, in a language it had not, until this moment occurred to her that it could be spoken. She did not, however, permit it at once to move her mouth. She had, over 4 years, learned that the difference between a woman who was thought worth a sentence and a woman who was thought worth a life was, more often than not, the fraction of a second she allowed the sentence to stand in the air before she answered it, and she permitted the sentence, now, to stand. It stood. The rain, at the window, permitted it to stand. The fire, in the grate, permitted it to stand. Sir Adrian, in the chair, permitted it to stand, and did not look up from the fire, because a long life had taught him what to look at and what not. "Your Grace," Isolde said, "at last I have listened to what you have said, and I believe you. It is not, in me, easy to believe such a sentence spoken in such a room by such a man, and yet I do. I ask you now to listen to what I shall say, in return, and to permit me to say it without interruption, as you have been permitted to say what you have said." He inclined his head. He did not speak. "I have been called, in this county, ornamental," she said, and heard, in her own voice, the words set down at last with the small dry weight it had been carrying for 4 years. It has been said kindly, sometimes, and unkindly more often, and it has been intended, in either case, to place me where a vase is placed, near the door, useful for a moment on the way in, invisible on the way out. I have, for 4 years, permitted the placing. I have learned the exact fraction of the head that manners require, and the exact fraction of the tongue that survival requires, and I have used them both, and I have kept, in a locket at my throat, 8 words in my mother's hand, and I have said them to myself, silently, on the evenings, when the household did not require me for anything else. The 8 words are, small things carry their own weight. I have believed them, in some fashion, all 4 years. I have believed them, in another and larger fashion, only in the last 6 weeks. I am not, Your Grace, a woman who can be picked up in a ballroom in November and placed on a mantel shelf in December because a duke has found her, of a sudden, to his taste. I am a woman who has been in this room, in one form or another, for 4 years, and who has, in those 4 years, done a great deal of small work that no one has seen, and who has, in the last 6 weeks, begun, slowly, to permit that work to be seen. I am not, Your Grace, ready to be lifted. I am only ready to be met. If what you have said to me tonight is a lifting, I must refuse it. If it is a meeting, I shall accept it, on the condition that the meeting be, in every particular, honest, and that we agree. Now, that neither of us shall pretend, at any future date, in any future room, that the meeting was anything other than what it is. He listened without interruption, as she had asked. His face, in the 2 candles' light, did not, in the listening, alter. His hand, at his side, did not lift. When she had finished, he did not at once speak. He waited, in the small, careful way he had of waiting, for the length of time it takes a fire to shift once in its grate. Then he said, quietly, Miss Vane, I accept the condition. I do not offer a lifting. I do not know how, at my age, to lift anything. I offer a meeting. I offer, further, my word that no sentence I speak in your hearing, from this hour, shall be a sentence I would not speak in your hearing had you not been born to a good family or a poor one, a great household or a small. I offer, further, my hand. If you will take it, and if you will not, my hand shall remain where it is, and shall wait. He extended it. He did not, in the extending, cross the last portion of the distance. He left it at the edge of the rug, palm up, the way a man leaves an offer that has, in it, no coercion. Isolde looked at the hand. She looked then at his face. She looked then at Sir Adrian, who was still looking at the fire. She looked then at her own hand, which had, without her permission, risen a small fraction from her side and stopped. She permitted it, at last, to cross the remainder of the distance. She placed it in his. He closed his fingers about hers with the exact fraction the moment required, and no more, and he did not, then or after, let it go. She felt, in the closing, the small, dangerous warmth she had refused, on the terrace, to permit to become anything else, and she permitted it, now, to be what it had, all along been. She permitted, too, the small, cathartic weight that had been gathering behind her eyes for 4 years to rise to the surface at last, and she did not, in the rising, look away from him, because she had learned in the last 6 weeks that truth reaching the surface was not collapse, and did not require of a person who had earned it. That she hide her face. She permitted 1 tear to fall. She permitted no others. She said, quietly, yes, Your Grace. On those terms. Yes, Sir Adrian, at the fire, inclined his head to the fire, and permitted himself, for the second time that evening, the small movement at the corner of his mouth. He rose. He crossed the small room. He placed 1 dry hand, for a moment, on Isolde's shoulder, and then, for a moment, on the Duke's arm. He said quietly, "You will forgive me. I shall now go and be, for a quarter of an hour, in the front room, where I shall be as visible as I can contrive. That will, I think, be useful." He inclined his head. He went. The door, which had not quite closed properly behind him. The rain at the window continued. The fire in the grate continued. The Duke of Ashenmere did not let go of her hand. He said quietly at the last, "Isolde," she heard, in the speaking of her name in his voice, the small, quiet sentence her mother had, once, at Ashfield Row, spoken in a voice barely above a breath, to her father at the door of the back parlor. And she heard, in the sentence her mother had spoken then, and in the sentence he spoke now, the same shape. And she thought, in the small, clean chamber at the back of her mind, that a woman is fortunate who hears the shape twice in a lifetime. "Sebastian," she said, quietly, in return, because it was the sentence the shape required, and he inclined his head, as a man inclines his head when he has been given a thing he had not thought he would live to be given, and he did not let go of her hand. They stood there for a quarter of an hour at the mantelshelf in the small back room, while the rain came down over Cavendish Square. Colonel Halliday's clock struck the quarter. Sir Adrian in the front room was as visible as he had promised. Lady Marlbrook at the tea drank her cold tea slowly. Cressida Marlbrook at the far end of the first room did not, that evening, laugh the pearled laugh again. Perpetua at her mother's side understood, without being told, that a small alteration in the arithmetic of the county had, in the last quarter of an hour, taken place, and she permitted her small, careful smile to alter with it, because she had been taught, above all, to smile in the direction the arithmetic went. The storm, over the square, broke, and rebuilt, and broke again, and by the time it had exhausted itself, the small back room was empty, and the 2 candles on the mantel-shelf were guttering, and Colonel Halliday, coming in, found only the marks on the rug where 2 people had stood at a mantel-shelf for a quarter of an hour, without moving, and he closed the door on the marks, and said nothing of them to any person. By spring, the county's small unwritten book had been rewritten in a hand no one had, at the beginning of the winter, expected to see. The rain that had begun over Cavendish Square that night had held for 3 days, and had, in the holding, washed the last of the frost out of the streets, and after the rain the county had begun to move again. And the small, careful movements that had begun in December had, by the end of February, become larger movements, and by the end of March had become, in some rooms, the shape of the season. The correction in the almanac had appeared in the January number, in the exact language Mr. Sylvester Aldous had promised, and had named Miss Isolde Vane as the author of the article on the management of a country still-room, and had regretted, in a short second paragraph, the error of the previous November, and had not named the cousin of Lord Marlbrook, because the cousin of Lord Marlbrook had, at the request of Sir Adrian Vane, written a private letter to Mr. Aldous acknowledging the error, and Sir Adrian had asked in return that the letter be treated as sufficient. The design for the conservatory at Marlbrook Court had been copied, honestly, into the plans for the small conservatory on the Duke of Ashenmare's northern estate, and the small conservatory had, in the 3rd week of February, been rebuilt in the new frame, and had not, in the 4 months since, cracked. The letter of the 4th of December had been traced, by a gentleman of Sir Adrian's acquaintance, to a hand that had been trained to lean forward, and was, on the day of the letter, asked to lean backward, and the hand had been identified, in the private ledger of the Duke of Ashenmere, as belonging to a young woman in pale blue, and the identification had been laid before Sir Adrian. And Sir Adrian had, in a quiet interview at the house of Lord Marlbrook in the 2nd week of January, laid the identification before Lady Marlbrook, and had informed her, in exact language, that the Duke of Ashenmere considered the matter closed on the understanding that the young woman in pale blue would, for the remainder of the season, receive no further invitations from any house on a list that Sir Adrian had, in that interview, placed on the table, and that Lady Marlbrook would oblige him by seeing to it that her niece Cressida Marlbrook understood the terms. Lady Marlbrook had, at the interview, said nothing. Silence was, in that dressing-room, a form of consent, and Sir Adrian had learned, in a long life, to hear it. Cressida Marlbrook did not, in the spring, appear at the houses on the list. She appeared at other houses, and at the other houses she was received with the exact fraction of the head that manners required, and no more, and she found, over the course of a fortnight, that the exact fraction was smaller than she had, in her lifetime, been accustomed to receive, and she withdrew, after Easter, to her mother's house in the country, and did not return that year to town. Perpetua Marlbrook, at her mother's small signal, transferred her small, careful smile from the direction of Lord Halberd, whose interest had, over the winter, cooled, to the direction of a young clergyman, with expectations from a great-uncle in Cheshire, and by the end of April was engaged to him. And Isolde, at her aunt's small dry request, wrote the letters of announcement in her own hand, and did not, in the writing, alter a syllable, because there was no syllable in her that wished, any longer, to be altered. Sir Adrian Vane took a small house in Half Moon Street for the season, and Isolde, at his request, and with the exact fraction of consent that Lord Marlbrook and Lady Marlbrook were, by the end of January, in no position to refuse, removed from the room at the top of the back stair on Cavendish Street to a room on the first floor of the house in Half Moon Street that looked out over a plane tree and a length of pale spring sky, and Sir Adrian, in the mornings, worked with her at a small writing desk in the front parlor on the papers of her father's estate, which he had, at last, permitted himself to lay before her, and which he had, at the end of a fortnight, laid open on the table with his dry finger on a line at the bottom of a page, and had said, quietly, "There it is. There is a little more here than we had thought. Child, not a great deal." Enough, and Isolde had looked at the line, and at his finger, and at his face, and had inclined her head, and had said, quietly, "It is enough, uncle. It has always been enough." And Sir Adrian had, without looking up, permitted himself a third small movement at the corner of his mouth. By the middle of May, the Queen's spring drawing-room had been announced, and by the end of May, at a private audience arranged, in exact language, by Sir Adrian Vane, and by the Duke of Ashenmere, without either of them appearing in any correspondence to have arranged anything at all, Miss Isolde Vane had been received by Her Majesty in her own name and not as an appendage of any party, and Her Majesty, who had known Isolde's mother in a small season long ago, and had in that season formed a small quiet opinion of her, had asked, with an interest that was not a courtesy, after the design for the conservatory at Ashenmere, and had been shown, by Isolde, a small folded copy of the drawing carried, that afternoon, in the pocket of a plain gown, and had inclined her head, and had said, quietly, "It is a great pity, Miss Vane, that a good drawing should have waited so long to be looked at in the correct room. It has been looked at now. That is well." Isolde had curtsied. She had not, in the curtsy, either lowered her eyes further than manners required, or raised them. She had heard, in the small quiet chamber at the back of her mind, the sentence her aunt had spoken 4 years earlier, at the door of the small back parlor on Cavendish Street, that a young woman in her position must be very grateful for the kindnesses shown her, and she had heard, at the same time, the sentence Sir Adrian had spoken in the library at Cavendish Street on the night of the 6th of December, that grace and honesty were not always opposed, and she had answered, in the private chamber, both of them at once with a sentence of her own, which was that gratitude honestly given was neither a debt nor a currency, and that she had, at last, arrived in the room in which she could give it. In the 3rd week of June, on the longest day of the year, a small gathering was held on the south lawn at Ashenmerry. It had begun, in Sir Adrian's arrangement with the Duke, as a small dinner for the household and the neighborhood. It had become, over the intervening month, in Sir Adrian's careful correspondence with a great many houses, a larger thing, which was the formal opening of the small conservatory that had, in February, been rebuilt in the new frame and had not cracked. 200 persons had been invited. 180 had come. They had come from the county and from the town, and from 3 counties beyond, and they had come, some of them, because the Duke of Ashenmerry had asked, and some of them because Sir Adrian Vane had asked, and some of them because Her Majesty, in the small, quiet way in which such interest was permitted to travel, had made known that she took an interest in the matter, and some of them because a great many other people had already accepted, and it would, they had discovered, be more remarkable to be absent than to be present. Lord Marlbrook came. Lady Marlbrook came. Perpetua, engaged now to her clergyman, came, and smiled the small, careful smile in the direction the arithmetic went. Cressida did not come. Mr. Sylvester Aldous came. Colonel Halliday came, and stood in the shade of a plane tree with Sir Adrian, and said nothing, and looked at the guests with the same look with which he had, in the winter, looked at the marks on the rug in his back room. The gathering was held on the south lawn, because the small conservatory stood at the end of the south lawn, at the meeting of the lawn and the old walled garden, and the conservatory itself, in the light of the longest day, was the visible answer to a question that had, 4 winters running, been answered wrongly by 4 other frames. The panes were clean. The frame did not sag. Inside, along the low benches, 100 small pots stood in ordered rows, and in the pots the beginnings of a still-room garden had begun, quietly, to grow. Along the ridge of the roof, where in the old frame a joint had cracked and cracked again, a single new bar of iron ran, slender and dark, and it did not, that afternoon, or in any afternoon since, complain. Isolde stood, at the beginning of the afternoon, at the door of the conservatory, and she received the guests as they came up the path. She wore, that day, a gown of pale spring green that Sir Adrian had, at her modest request, permitted the modist in Hanover Street to make her, and at her throat the small oval locket of dulled silver on the ribbon that had been washed too often to remember itself. She received each guest with the exact fraction of the head that manners required, and to those she had known in Marlbrook House and had known then to have been kind, she permitted her mouth the small movement it wished. To those she had known in Marlbrook House and had known to have been otherwise, she permitted only the fraction. It was enough. In the middle of the afternoon, when the guests had gathered, at Colonel Halliday's quiet suggestion, in a loose crescent about the door of the conservatory, and when the sun had reached the height at which the panes of the small building glittered but did not glare, the Duke of Ashenmerry stepped out of the crescent and stood at the door of the conservatory, and, without raising his voice, brought the small murmur of the gathering to a stop. He did not step onto anything. There was no dice. He stood on the same grass on which every other person in the gathering stood. He inclined his head to his guests. He began. "It is my custom," he said, "not to make speeches. I ask your patience this afternoon for a short one. There is a matter I owe, in this place and on this day, to the person to whom it is owed, and to owe it further would be, on my part, a discourtesy I do not care to add to those I have already, in the past year, owed her. A stillness settled over the crescent that was not the stillness of manners. It was, Isolde saw, the stillness a room takes on when it has understood, without being told, that something is about to be said that it will remember. Some months ago, the Duke said, quietly, in a ballroom not far from here, I said, of a young woman standing within my hearing, though I did not then know it, that she would be forgotten by spring. It was not, then or since, my finest sentence. I said it, as men in my position too often say such sentences, because I had not troubled to look at the person I was condemning, and because it is easier, in a ballroom, to place a sentence than to place a person. I was wrong. I wish, now, in the hearing of everyone here who was in that ballroom that evening, and of everyone here who was not, to say so. He did not look at Lady Marlbrook. He did not look at Lord Marlbrook. He did not look at Perpetua. He looked at Isolde, at the door of the conservatory, and he did not, once, in what followed, look away. I was wrong, he said, about her. I was wrong about the household that has for 4 years called her ornamental, and I was wrong about the county that in the same 4 years has permitted the calling. She is not ornamental. She has never, in any room she has ever entered, been ornamental. She has been, in every room she has ever entered, the reason the room continued to work when the persons at the center of it had ceased to attend to its working. She has been the one who has caught the snuff box that has fallen from the sleeve, and who has replaced the second footman with the third before the ices came up, and who has drawn, in pencil on the margin of a letter, the frame of a conservatory that has not, in 4 months, cracked, and who has done all of this without a single sentence of credit taken in a single room. She has, in every room I have seen her in, been the person who understood that small things carry their own weight, and who has, without fuss, carried them. She has been, further, in every room I have seen her in, the person who has known when to speak and when to be silent, and I have found, in the year in which I have watched her, that her silence has more often been in her favor than my speech has been in mine. He paused. The gathering did not move. I say to you, therefore, he said, quietly, that they were wrong. The rooms in which she was overlooked were wrong. The tongues that called her ornamental were wrong. The pens that put another name above her work were wrong. I was wrong. I say to you, further, that a county which does not learn, from a case such as this one, to look a second time at the young women it has been in the habit of overlooking, will not, in 20 years, deserve the young women it produces. And I say to you, last, that if I have done anything at all, in this house, in this year, of which I am not ashamed, it is that I have, at last, at the age at which most men have stopped learning, learned to look. I ask nothing of you this afternoon. I ask only that you look once at the woman standing at the door of this conservatory, and that you see, as you look, what I have been slow to see, and what she has, without complaint, waited to be seen. He inclined his head. He did not then add anything. He stepped back once so that the door of the conservatory, and Isolde at it, stood alone at the center of the crescent. The stillness held for the length of time it takes a small breeze to cross a lawn. Then the applause began. It began, first, at the far edge of the crescent, from Colonel Halliday and Sir Adrian in the shade of the plane tree, and it moved along the crescent, without hurry, and it gathered, as it moved, the exact quantity of hands the county had, over 4 years, denied her, and it was, at its height, not a polite applause. It was a genuine one. It went on longer than the Duke had planned, and he did not, in the going on, interrupt it, because a man of his exactness knew, when he had finished a sentence, to permit the sentence to be heard. Lady Marlbrook, at the edge of the crescent, applauded with the exact fraction of the hands that manners required. Perpetua, at her mother's side, applauded a little more than the fraction, because the arithmetic, that afternoon, went in a direction she had been taught to follow, and she had at length understood which direction it was. Lord Marlbrook applauded honestly, because he had always been an honest man in matters he had been permitted to notice, and Sir Adrian had, over the winter, permitted him to notice a great many. Mr. Aldous applauded, and did not, in the applauding, take his eyes from Isolde's face, and Isolde, at the door of the conservatory, permitted her face. At last, the small movement it had, all afternoon, wished, in the evening, when the guests had gone and the lawn had emptied, and the small conservatory stood at the end of the lawn under a sky that had begun to turn, at its western edge. The color of the ribbon at Isolde's throat when it had been new, the Duke of Ashenbury walked with Isolde along the gravel path between the house and the conservatory, and he stopped at the door of the conservatory, and he turned to her, and he took, again, the hand he had taken at the mantel-shelf in Colonel Halliday's back room, and he did not again let go of it. "Isolde," he said, quietly, "I have a question to ask you, and I would prefer, in the asking, to be honest rather than graceful, if you will permit the preference." "You have my permission, Sebastian," she said. He drew, once, a slow breath, in and out, and he said, "I do not ask you, because it would please the county, which it will not, and which I do not care whether it does. I do not ask you because it would please your aunt, which it will, in the manner in which such things please her, and which I care for still less. I do not ask you because it would repair, in some ledger, the sentence I spoke of you in November, which cannot, by any asking, be repaired, and which I do not, in truth, wish to repair, because it is the sentence that has, in the end, taught me the whole of what I know. I ask you because I have found, in the year in which I have known you, that when no one at all is watching, in a room in which there is no county and no aunt and no ledger and no ballroom, you are the person I still wish to be with. Will you marry me, Isolde?" She looked at him. She looked, past him, at the small conservatory, and at the beginnings of a still-room garden along its low benches, and at the single slender bar of iron that had not, in 4 months, complained. She looked, past the conservatory, at the western edge of the sky. She looked, at last, at his hand in hers. "Yes, Sebastian," she said. "Because I wish it." He inclined his head. He did not, then, speak. He did not need to. He raised her hand, once, to his mouth, at the exact fraction the moment required, and he lowered it, and he did not let go. The storm that had, all evening, been gathering along the northern edge of the county came in over the lawn at Ashenbury a little after midnight, and it broke over the house and the conservatory and the walled garden with the sudden, unapologetic force of a weather that had, at last, decided what it wished to be, and it held over the roofs until near 4 in the morning, and it exhausted itself, at last, over the fields to the south, and it left behind it a sky that had been washed clean of everything it had been carrying. Isolde stood, a little before dawn, at the tall window of the room that had been given to her at Ashenbury for the night, and she watched the last of the storm move away over the fields, and she watched, along the eastern edge of the sky, the first pale line of a light that had not, all winter and all spring, arrived quite in the shape it arrived in now. Sir Adrian, at the door, inclined his head, and withdrew, because a long life had taught him what to look at and what not. And Isolde crossed the room and opened the door onto the small stone terrace above the walled garden, and she stepped out into the wet gray air, and she was not, on the terrace, alone. The Duke of Ashenbury was at the balustrade. He turned. He held out his hand. She crossed the terrace and placed her hand in his, and he closed his fingers about hers with the exact fraction the moment required, and no more, and he did not let go, and they stood at the balustrade together, and they looked east, and the light along the edge of the sky moved, without hurry, up the roofs of the stable block and along the ridge of the small conservatory and across the wet lawn, to the gravel where, the afternoon before, a crescent had stood. Isolde said quietly, "Small things carry their own weight." He said quietly, "Yes." She said, "It is not perfect." He said, "No." She said, "It has not been easy." He said, "No." She said, "It is only shared." He inclined his head. He said quietly, "That is more than enough." The light, along the edge of the sky, reached the terrace. It found their joined hands at the balustrade. It did not, in the finding, hurry. It moved on, without comment, over the walled garden and the fields beyond, and Isolde Vaughan, who had been called ornamental in a great many rooms in a great many years, and who had, at last, in a small conservatory at the end of a south lawn, been called by her right name in the hearing of a county that had, at last, learned how to listen, drew, once, a slow breath in and out, and turned her face toward the morning, and did not, then or after, let go of the hand in hers.